Okay, welcome everyone. We might slowly get started. There's about 50 people here, so I think that's a good audience to start with. Some more people are trickling in. Welcome to the first of the Disaffection seminar series, Feeling in Crisis. I'm Ben Cook. I've put this series together and I'm really glad to be starting here with Carolyn Pedwell and Eva von Redecker, who will be presenting two just published books that I think speak to each other quite well, and I hope they think so too, and we'll discuss that throughout this. Before we get started, I just wanted to acknowledge the traditional owners, the Wurundjeri people on whose land we meet today, and where we'll meet over the course of the entire seminar series. Wherever you're joining us from, I would encourage you to look up some info online about the traditional owners of the land where you live and work, or if you're joining from the colonial metropoles, maybe consider the implications between here and there. I would like to pay respect to elders past and present and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded and the struggle for justice continues. So I just wanted to quickly introduce our two speakers. Two books are there on the screen. No doubt you will have seen the details when you registered for the event, so I won't spend too long on this. We have speaking first, Dr. Carolyn Pedwell, who's a reader in cultural studies at the University of Kent and the author of 3 monographs with the revolutionary routines, the habits of social transformation, just out as the third of those. And then speaking second, we have Dr. Eva von Redecker, a German critical theorist and public philosopher, currently based at the University of Verona as a research fellow. And she's the author of Praxis and Revolution, a theory of social transformation, just published in English by Columbia University Press, and author of other books that are out in German, but not yet in English. So this is a topic that continues to be of interest to Eva. So in a way, this is a sort of quasi-book launch, we might say, with two books that seem to speak to similar themes from slightly different angles, which I hope will be fruitful in discussion today. So we have an hour for this session. They'll speak for 15 minutes each, and then we'll have a quick response, possibly, to each other's presentations, and then have a Q&A. Feel free to put sort of comments, questions in the chat as we go, but once we get to that part of the program, it might opt for people with their hands up just to make things easier, and then go to the chat for any questions that are lingering after people have raised their hands. I should also just say something about the series, I guess. Again, you will also have seen some of this information when you registered, so it's not something I want to dwell on for the moment, but the idea of addressing disaffection comes from the sort of feeling that it's a rather prevalent feeling in contemporary society, but also one that is treated sort of glancingly in academic analysis. It's not necessarily something that has been theorized or conceptualized, at least not in a sort of thoroughgoing way. And so this series is a set of reflections on that topic coming from different angles, not necessarily giving us a final answer, but starting today with the topic of revolution and habit and praxis, obviously, but also later in the series, there'll be some discussion of aesthetics and disaffection, and also for example, the laws around disaffection in post-colonial India, and a sort of parallel interest in disalienation alongside disaffection with Camille Robsis. So yeah, it covers different territory each week, so feel free to register for those that interest you. Now I'll stop sharing so that Carolyn can share. And we might kick off. Thanks.
Right. Yeah, sorry, just one moment. Okay. Sorry, just as I'm faffing with trying to share my screen. There we go. Sorry, is that working now? Yeah, okay. Sorry about that. With all this online teaching, you think after 2 years I could share my screen in a matter of a moment, but no. I want to thank Ben so much for organizing this event and this series, which just sounds fascinating. I think Eva and I are both excited to be the first seminar in this series to kick it off. Thanks to everyone for being here. And I think what's most exciting to me about today's event is it's given me the opportunity to read Eva's fascinating book over the last few weeks. First published, I think, in German in 2018, but the English translation has just come out, I think, in the last week or so. So this has been a really great opportunity. And in reading Eva's work, I've been struck by how many significant resonances I think there are between our two projects, as well as I hope some thought-provoking differences. Now, Eva might want to correct me here, but I think that we're both fundamentally interested in how it is that social change, and particularly what we might think of as affirmative social change, actually happens, and how it happens in the face of the multitude of factors that persistently prevent it from happening in different contexts. And alongside this, I think we are both interested in how the concept of revolution might be generatively rethought, particularly at the current social, political, and economic conjuncture in which traditional or received conceptualizations of revolution just don't really hold in the same way anymore. So in addressing these questions, Eva focuses on the idea of praxis and the related concepts of interstices and metallipsis. And I work through the concept of habit and the associated notion of the minor. So I guess one question we might keep in mind today, or that I've been thinking through, at least in reading from the outset, is how we might understand the relationship between praxis and habit, and indeed what difference it might make when we're thinking about revolution or social transformation to lead with one concept or the other. What different journeys might leading with one or the other take us on, and where might we end up? Now, one of the things, the many things I found very impressive and useful about Eva's work is the extremely rich, mainly European historical context that unfolds in order to help us think through the possible meanings, but also the materialities, the context and the structural conditions in which revolution might be possible and with what implications. And Eva does this through bringing together various social and political theories and philosophies with really interesting and illuminating literary works, from Mary Wollstonecraft's novella, Maria, to the different site of contemporary forms of feminist and queer literary and artistic practices. My own project's efforts to unfold the links between habits and processes of social change stages conversation between pragmatist and continental philosophers, both historical and contemporary, and more current social, cultural, and affect theories, with focus on North America and the UK rather than Europe mainly. So with respect to the seminar series' very suggestive theme of disaffection, which Ben has spoken to a little bit, I guess I wanted to start my bit by noting how my book, Revolutionary Routines, actually emerges from some of my past work on affect and empathy. So a book that I wrote before this was about the politics of empathy. And one thing that I really noticed when I was doing the research and thinking for this book is how much of the literature on empathy, particularly literature that wants to connect empathy to the promise of social justice, focuses on the possibility of a kind of affective revolution, either at the level of the subject or different kinds of collectives that might actually make a difference that matters. And in the language of empathy, this is really often about if we could only affect this person or group, if this person or group could only be affective powerfully and profoundly enough, then maybe this time things would change. that our views of the world and our behavior and action would change in line with that new vision that is prompted. Now, the book I wrote about empathy is partly thinking about why that often doesn't happen. And I was concerned with kind of the ways in which empathy is folded into various transnational biopolitical and geopolitical projects that really make it an ongoing relationship of power that can lead to kind of repression, oppression, discipline, and control just as much as it might open up spaces of liberation. But after this project came to an end, I became a lot more interested in the materialities and immaterialities of social change. Materialities, not just in terms of structures of power, socially, politically, and economically, but also materialities in terms of the body, physiologically, neurologically, affectively. And this took me down the path of habit. Habit, in the first instance, was helping me to think about why these sorts of affective revolutions don't lead to wider forms of social transformation. Habit was a way to think about why persistent patterns stay in place, why they don't change. But as I inhabited that literature further, I realized that there are very long genealogies of thinking about habit in different ways. Thinking habit not just about stasis or stuckness, but about becoming, wonder, animation, and transformation. On a more personal note, I also wanted to mention, and this is something that I try to speak about in the preface to my book, that another reason that I think I came to habit was about a decade-long experience of quite intense and debilitating insomnia. But sometime in 2008, I just stopped really being able to sleep the way I had been before. It was a time of particular change, anxiety, and stress in my life. And I suddenly became aware of a habit that I had never recognized as a habit as such, the habitual nature of just being able to sleep without thinking about it. And in this time in my life, I tried all sorts of different things to try to dislodge my insomniac habit, from psychoanalysis, and cognitive behavioral therapy to acupuncture and mindfulness, but nothing really seemed to work. The harder that I tried to kind of be able to sleep, the less sleep was forthcoming. And I think in the end, a lot of different things happened, but what seemed to really make the difference at a particular point in time was just stopping trying to sleep. Rather than doing anything that might lead to sleep, I started to focus on the sensation of being awake. This was a form of affective inhabitation of the present that somehow led to a shift in affective attention that shook things up for me, and finally, in the end, made me believe that I could sleep again. So I mentioned this experience because I think fundamentally it changed the way I thought about change, both in my own life personally, but maybe with some wider implications. So these different paths of getting to my project meant that it became a project of rethinking both habit as a concept and also social transformation. And one of the ways I came to do this was to think about social change in a minor key. And this meant moving beyond traditional narratives of collective transformation to explore the minor processes that might be active beneath the surface of everyday life. So as the philosopher Erin Manning discusses in her thought-provoking book, The Minor Gesture, we often understand change in the major key, as emerging via significant events, turning point moments, or revolutionary upheaval. Yet as both the visceral experience of insomnia and the various philosophies of habit that I was encountering around the same time underscore, perhaps it's actually more often the less perceptible, more processual and minor dynamics of habit that are vital to transformation. Now for Erin Manning and for myself, the minor is not simply what is seemingly insignificant or what is happening at a micro level, nor does it necessarily correspond to the figure of the marginal, although it might well encompass all of these. But where Manning puts the emphasis, following Deleuze and Guattari's articulation, is for the minor to name those continually unfolding, yet often unrecognized dynamics that could open up everyday experience to its potential variation. How could the everyday be otherwise? In interpreting social change in a minor key, then, I wanted to explore how everyday habits constitute crucial sites and technologies for transformation, but actually they're ones that are often overlooked or cast aside if we focus only on major chords. And I think there is a close link here to Eva's similarly process-oriented endeavor to think revolution beyond the Bastille, as Eva puts it, through attention, and I quote, to everyday practices exemplified by a relationship constellation in a prison, a gathering of knitting women, a militant drag queen, and a runaway granddaughter. For both of us, I think our focus on the long duration, the unfolding dynamics of social transformation leads us to a different perspective in how change happens. And it's certainly one, I think, for both of us where any public-private distinction is radically disrupted. Now, over the past decade or more, we've seen an emergent critical return to notions of habit and habituation that's been gaining momentum across a range of fields, with scholars engaging the work of continental philosophy, pragmatism, classical sociological theory, phenomenology, psychoanalysis, neuroscience, and more recently, computational media, to rethink the contemporary workings of social life. But what I learned through my reading process is that, of course, habit has a very long history in sociology and philosophy, dating back at least as far as Aristotle. But as the philosopher Catherine Malibu has argued, since the 20th century, habits have generally been associated with bad habits, with mindless forms of repetition, or I guess more generally, with just that which keeps things the same, physically, socially, politically, economically. But there's an earlier genealogy of thought, starting with Aristotle, moving through Hegel, and down through Henri Bergson and Gilles Deleuze, which associates habit with processes of becoming, invention, and change. So bringing together these different strands in my work, I focus on what I call the double logic of habit, how habit attunes us simultaneously to the powerful automated processes and mechanisms underlying the tendency of patterns of oppression and equality to persist, despite our repeated efforts to make them visible. And at the same time, the necessary yet counterintuitive role in habituation in enabling meaningful and enduring forms of social and political transformation. Now, the key thinkers for me in this project are the American pragmatist philosophers William James and John Dewey, who, as I'm sure you know, were writing in the late 1800s and the early to mid 1900s, but also a thinker who may not be as familiar, the French philosopher Félix Ravissant, who was writing in the mid 1880s. Ravissant's book Of Habit was first published in French in 1838, but it wasn't actually translated into English until 2008. So in terms of English-speaking context, it's been a much more recent intervention into the debates. Now, there's some notable differences between these thinkers that I try to engage with in the book, but I think what links them is that they didn't simply understand habit as mindless repetition that keeps the status quo intact, like Descartes, Kant, as well as other thinkers of their own day. Rather, they explored the vital role of habit in processes of transformation and becoming. Indeed, maybe what their work illustrates most powerfully is that while the automatic force of habit can compel us to repeat previous modes of action again and again, it's nonetheless only through processes of habituation that new tendencies might be created, which don't simply fizzle away, but are actually deeply rooted enough and robust to endure. And this point, I think, also is crucial for my project, is that their work, and particularly Dewey's work, also opens out to thinking through what I call habit assemblages, continually unfolding interactions between bodies and environments. And from this perspective, habits are never individual, they're never static, and they're always more than human. And I think those elements are crucial to how I want to understand habit, to think about social transformation beyond the personal or individual. These are about assemblages or ecologies of events, bodies, objects, and processes that are coming together. Now, what these classical thinkers are not great at, unsurprisingly, I guess, is addressing the links between habit and power. the role of habit, that is, in processes of regulation, violence, and even annihilation. So Dewey, James, and Ravison tend to understand habituation as a neutral mechanism, which can support a range of biological and social functions and possibilities. But as we know, other critical scholars have explored how embodied habits are reproduced through dominant modes of social intelligibility, which often work in exclusionary and violent ways. And I turned to a number of different literatures to try to think through these questions. I think a key primary resource in the development of my own thinking over the last 20 years is, of course, Judith Butler on gender performativity, how attending to the generativity of habituation, Butler argues, must confront the simultaneous production of uninhabitability. This term uninhabitability has been really suggested for me. In Butler's words, the constitution of a domain of unthinkable, abject, and unlivable bodies. And these lines of thought, I think, are reflected also in slightly different ways in genealogies of radical Black thought. I draw on the work of George Yancey and Claudia Rankine in my work, as well as various queer and trans theories. And a primary kind of founding resource there that's also, of course, been important for affect theory is Eve Sedgwick. So in thinking social change in a minor key then, a key contribution of my book is to bring classical accounts of habit into conversation with feminist, queer, anti-racist, and decolonial theory and practice to develop a speculative pragmatist approach to collective transformation. Now, I think the coining of that term, or at least the popularization of it, belongs to Brian Masumi and Erin Manning. In my work, this is an approach that aims to think about the world speculatively as composed of changing events that are, in Dewey's words, moving, fraught with possibilities and not ended or final, but at the same time to address the persistence and malleability of habits, including those linked to racism, sexism, xenophobia, classism, homophobia, transphobia, and ableism. So I do this through thinking about a number of different cases, the affective habits of social and cultural theory, modes of governing through habit in the contemporary domain that are informed by behavioral economics, such as nudge theory and policy in the UK and North America, the persistence and malleability of habits of white privilege and white supremacy in the context of Trump and Brexit and their particular affective politics, the international refugee crisis and the implications of our purported affective habituation to digitally mediated images of violence and suffering. And finally, the algorithmic habits of networked activism, such as Black Lives Matter and Occupy in the midst of racial capitalism and contemporary media ecologies. And here I'm interested in how we might think about prefigurative politics in a digital age. And I think this is another important connection to Eva's work, who provides actually a much richer historical context for the emergence of prefigurative politics. And I'd actually be really interested in Eva's thoughts about thinking about this in the context of Occupy and what comes after, and particularly in relation to digital and computational media. In conclusion then, within the alternative ontology of social transformation that I seek to map out, minor processes are as significant as major events, and progress is continually unfolding via everyday gestures, affects, and habits. So I suppose what is most vital to the possibility of collective change from this perspective is cultivating shared capacities to sense the minor currents running through major configurations. Modes of affective inhabitation, that is, which attune us to the emergent possibilities for current tendencies and relationships to materialize otherwise, whether that's with respect to neoliberalism, racial capitalism, populism, algorithmic life, or the endlessly stretched out present of our global coronavirus pandemic. I'll leave that there because hopefully that's opened up a number of different points of resonance and difference, and pass over to Eva now.
Shall I just, yeah, thank you so much. Wow, that was so interesting and very generous. I also want to thank Ben for having us here and also continuing across a great distance the intellectual exchange that we already started when you were in Berlin. And since this is a as Ben said, quasi book launch, I also just want to start by congratulating Carolyn to her book coming out, because I think it's such a great, wonderful achievement. And it's I mean, as you just heard, very important, but also just a beautiful object. And I'm very much looking forward to adding it to my bookshelf. I hope we really have enough time to discuss. So I try to just jumble together a few of the key thoughts of my book, and especially the two tongue-twisting core concepts. And then I think in the second half of my discussion, I will already move to responding to some of the themes that Carolyn brought up, and then maybe she can respond once more before we open up. So my project in that book is about the form of revolution, and that might be a bit depressing because it has not so much of the actual content. So Carolyn's book is much more rich in that way. Like if you want to think through the pandemic and through Trump and through Black Lives Matter, then there's actually the material there, whereas I am going on and on about the French Revolution, and part of the excuse or the rationale for that is that I wanted to take the kind of quintessential prototypical event revolution, sort of our paradigm for thinking about revolution, and then show that even there it makes sense to establish a processual interpretation. Because if I say something like, oh, the beauty of the feminist movement is that it has understood that transformation is slow and processual, then people will always be like, yeah, sure, but that's gender, you know, it's this kind of everyday life thing. It's not really structural, like for a real revolution as an event. So that's why it's mostly on actually the end of the 18th century, with one exception where I discuss some material from ACT UP. However, so the AIDS crisis, and especially late 80s in the US. However, this is also not a historical book. I'm far too impatient intellectually to make a good historian, but a book of social theory, or like cultural theory, and in that, or social philosophy, like Carolyn's as well. And what I try to establish is the vocabulary and the kind of picture of the social formation as a whole and of power, in which we can make sense or can make plausible make plausible the idea of change being processual and slow and yet radical. And one could say that my starting point is a very simple and compelling differentiation that Eric Olin Wright drew between ruptural change, where you kind of break between the before and the after, what he called symbiotic change, where you change through the core, where you operate with the core institutions of a given society. Like classic example is sort of if you want to get elected into office, but then change everything, like the Social Democrats of the 19th century did. And interstitial change, which comes kind of from the interstices and the, well, minor places, Carolyn called it, of society. And I find the last model very, very compelling. So that's what I delve into to counter what I saw as a kind of polarization in thinking through transformation after the loss of a certain dialectical Marxist model, that you had, on the one hand, a kind of wild notion of the event as being something, of revolution being an event of a totally different order, where you can only, for something to be a revolution, it has to break with everything, especially kind of stop and kill all habits that there are. And the revolution is, for instance, like when Badiou, the nature of it is sort of a truth and not human agency that is even partly passive and unreflective. So against that model, I wanted to really give the strongest interpretation possible of the slow and processual one. And that's, of course, something that was already ongoing in social theory of the time. Just like Carolyn mentioned Judith Butler, I was very interested in her theory of performativity, and also some comparable practice theories that also call themselves practice theory, following the work of Anthony Giddens and, for instance, in William R. Sewell, that all already had actually developed something of the sort of theory of everyday life being malleable and changeable. However, not so much. It was always just like subversion, or you can have iteration, like the repetition with a difference. But the idea that from this mesh of, and I always want to call it habit because it's so beautiful in Carolyn's work, but from this mesh of practice and the repetition, that you could really get to actual radical change. I felt that wasn't really theorized yet. So that's what I tried to test, whether it's possible. And then if you kind of look at the topology or the pattern of social change that you get from such a perspective, then what I like to call it is, with that term taken from Eric Olin Wright, an interstitial process of change, where you can really imagine you have kind of a few cracks and little dots of the new, and then you kind of slowly over time see that growing, and suddenly what used to be the crack is now the kind of hard piece, or the kind of, that's the center, or like if you think of it as grouting, and that's the tile and not the crack in between or something. So that's this picture of the interstitial, if you think of it topographically. And that's, I think, compellingly fitting with all those approaches to prefigurative politics that we have in the anarchist tradition, definitely, also in some parts of the Black radical tradition. So Adrienne Marie Brown, for instance, she talks of emergent politics. It's an interstitial approach. Also Fred Moten, when he speaks of fugitive politics, there is this sort of idea of working through the interstices, and then this has also been adapted, for instance, by Jack Halberstam into queer theory. She also, he speaks of interstitial change very affirmatively. But then what seemed to me to be the main intellectual challenge to those approaches that I kind of effectively liked so much and preferred so much to certain fantasies of militancy and change coming from a different order, is the question of why should that ever be powerful enough? Like, how from those minor sites or those interstices, how could you grow to be the new core? Because that's not like, this is not happening in a vacuum where there aren't counterforces. And so thinking that just like over time it will grow is something that with Berlin you could call cruel optimism. And also there's clearly something wrong in this sort of stance of saying, be the change you want to see. I mean, you know, often you lose and get smashed as instead of seeing the change you wanted to see. So how to think about this this translation into the big scale without making the minor practices just insignificant again and say, well, that's just a sort of side playing field. And then then I think we move a bit more to the temporal dynamic. So if you said the interstitial is more like the topography, now what's the timing of revolution? We already said it was processual, it's kind of slow and it's a process, but what makes that process even move in the right direction? And then one way that one could formulate is to say, and that's already contained a bit in the prefigurative, that you have a weird change between the before and after of revolution. Like you always need to anticipate the after of revolution before the revolution to happen. And like one way of using this word metaleptic refers just to that. It's a play of words where you reverse the order of what comes before and after, and you already you exchange cause and result. But then again, why would you can anticipate all you want and then it ends and the old takes hold, or there's some kind of new fascism, there's like something else new, but the bad new that takes over. And then to me, the kind of fleshing out the conditions under which such interstitial transformation might succeed, and in which you come from something that is interstitial, hardly intelligible on the hegemonic level, to a new paradigm. For something like solidarity, hardly believe that it's possible in a market economy, and then you think, well, we could actually build a whole society on that. Or abolitionism, like you have a white supremacist society, it just seems like madness to abolish prisons, and then to think like, no, that's a different concept of freedom. We could build a whole society on that. And I think the enabling context for such a transition is one where between the old interstitial practice and new paradigm, you have established structures, but that are ambivalent. So they are anchored in the given hegemonic order or paradigm, but they can be, as it were, contamined or hijacked by the interstitial practice, so that they're refunctioned, or they flip in the light of the new habit or the formerly unintelligible practice, so that then you have articulated on a kind of broader and more powerful plane an alternative and that does something to the powers that are. Just by having an actual counterexample, you've changed the status of taken for grantedness. And of course, then you need to iterate and repeat and grow on that to really build a new paradigm. And sometimes still that will not work, but if it works, then it will always work through this kind of two-step transfer, or this mediation of going through established but ambivalent structure to new paradigm. And now for my last 2 minutes, I think, and then that's what I call metalepsis, and I think it's a different figure from dialectics, because it's not just it's not a contradiction that gets resolved, but it's a sort of juxtaposition, like some aberrant practice, some anomaly disintegrates the old order and opens it up for a new, but without, like, with retaining some contingency in the picture. And that can play out also in a fairly unconscious level. And I think that's something I'm so interested in, want to discuss more with Carolyn, because I think she's even more brave than me with really getting rid of the idea that we need some conscious oversight of that, or that the avant-garde is always where we control that process, but it might be where we just let go and then the change happens. But for this not to fall back into saying, well, but after all, you've just said structural, so you need a different level to fix your change for you, then the first half of my book builds or works on definitions of practice and structure, and how they are not two different levels in social ontology or social theory, but how the best way to understand social structures is as aggregated social practice, or as sort of repeated and congealed, repetitive routines, and which then anchor in certain, so I spoke of paradigms already, anchor in certain paradigmatic patterns, but still those also are nothing but a certain practice that has become the ground for a lot of other things. So, like, if you think of the French Revolution, the idea of human rights was completely unintelligible before, and afterward, like, our whole politics, some part of our subjectivity is anchored in this new form, and it's kind of the matrix of politics. And so that would be one of such shifts. So making good on this idea that we can see even radical change coming from a matrix of everyday practice depends on this account of structures as themselves aggregated practice. And so if that's the picture, then maybe I want to say 3 things back to Caroline. And that the first is that I love this, you found such a beautiful phrase with this revolution in minor key, and I want to just share something because, that it made me think of, which is, you know, minor key in music is also this kind of more melancholic atmosphere. And something that has only become more clear to me after writing this book is that part of why I think we nowadays can't even dream anymore of a notion of revolution that is just a big seizure of the riches and the power that there is because we have such a different level of not just awareness, but like really experience and knowledge of how what is there, the power and the riches, is so contaminant and toxic with the debris of past bad habits of practice. So there is not only like that there is the subjectivities that aren't ready for freedom and solidarity, but also like just very literally at the end of the era of fossil capitalism, we don't just have like all the factories that the workers can take over, but we have all that bloody waste, like air pollution in the air, CO2 in the air, the toxic grounds. So we also need to do something with that stuff. And there's not just this glory in conquering something in revolution, but also the kind of melancholy and knowing that we still have to do so much care and reworking. And so I think that also, that's what you evoked with this formulation of minor key. That's why we need sustainable habits to do so. And then maybe just as two philosophical questions, so when you say that habits, so there's one strand where you stress very much that talking about change through habits allows one to think of unconscious change, and that the change kind of happens precisely when you sort of stop to want it or stop to be fixated on a certain outcome. And then on the other hand, you do push against an understanding of habits as mindless. So you draw on those theorists who, I mean, especially with Dewey, then he has it's quite a conscious idea of routine because it sort of solves social problems and addresses them. And so I mean, I guess the answer is anyway, not either or, but I would really like to know whether with some examples, whether you think there's a sort of interplay of being conscious one moment and then letting go, or whether we should sort of inhabit passively also practices that maybe feel right and trust that we might not even know yet why that's the solution or something like that. That I would be very interested in. And then the second question, I think, do you think that, what do you make with the fact that the new habits often require a break with old habits, and that seems to be so aggression unleashing in so many contexts? Like, I don't have an answer to that in that book. So like if you had one, that would be really great, because I still think in my work, then when I talk about this transference and then the old integrates and then you replace it with a new practice, it always sounds like, yeah, then in the end the old goes away. But you know, if it comes back with a vengeance, how, like, and I think we see that in so many places in contemporary life, that you, as a feminist, you get completely outsized aggression back at even the slightest, whatever, killjoy politics or something. So how do you get people over the loss of old habits? That would be the second question. And because we're quite into the discussion, I don't need to respond again. Like, let's definitely open after Carolyn responds.
Should I even respond, Ben? I mean, these are really thought-provoking questions. I'm just wondering about, we've got 14 minutes left. Oh, you're muted, Ben.
I think you should. I think they're important questions.
Absolutely. I mean, I want to say, first of all, that I really appreciated the focus on the structural and like the actual structural processes and conditions in which revolution might be possible or not in a given context that Eva offers. And to pick up on that point you said, Eva, about like, but what actually is structure? And even though in sociology and other fields we've had decades and decades of thinking about this and structure and agency and so forth, I do feel that we still often use structure as a shorthand without necessarily unpacking what structural conditions of power might consist of, kind of materially and immaterially. So to think about structures actually in part incorporating practice and praxis and process, I think is really helpful. This point Eva mentions, or questions you ask about kind of the role of consciousness or less than consciousness in social change is also a question I had in relation to Eva's work and where we situate ourselves. I mean, I guess by looking at habit, then you automatically are turning your attention to the entanglement of conscious and less than conscious modes of action. I guess that's kind of a definition of what habit is. So you're already pushing yourself to think about how much of what happens in daily life, both big and small, involves modes of action that are not necessarily unconscious, but less than conscious. And this is a continually unfolding state of relations that we are continually, as subjects, as bodies, as organisms, as collectives, as assemblages, moving in and out of different forms of consciousness and attention and inattention. And I think there are some tensions kind of in my book about what that means for social transformation. I guess fundamentally, I think that it's generative to open up a wider kind of spectrum or constellation of varying and changing modes of consciousness and less than consciousness, attention and inattention, through which social change, but also solidarity might take shape in given contexts. There still seems to be an emphasis a lot of the time on not only rational conscious thought, but kind of moving away from kind of less than conscious habits or breaking out of them to think about deliberate critical thinking or action. And for me, this is often not seriously taking account of how much of what we do and say and think all the time depends on structures of habit, that much of which are less than conscious. So what would it mean, for example, to rethink dominant ideas of political solidarity, to not only think about the kind of conscious critical modes of coming together with others and sharing political objectives and ethics, but also to think about the less than conscious affects, habits, practices, modes of reverberation that create forms of resonance and relationality that might be important. And if we do so, how might that open up opportunities for solidarity to not only include people who already know what they want and know what they think, are committed with others to trying to achieve that objective, but also people who don't know what they think yet, might be moving more intuitively through various political spaces and sites, who might be able to connect on a different kind of level. So I think, Eva, as you say, maybe that is more about a kind of more affective motive intuition or attunement to inhabiting spaces, and a more sense of kind of what's happening without necessarily knowing, because sometimes that not knowing could open up possibilities that are percolating beneath the surface but haven't been articulated in a major chord, and therefore are not necessarily intelligible or available to work with, but could be made to do so. I think I'm going to leave it there because that speaks to part of it, but obviously there's a lot more to think about and unfold.
Okay, thanks both. Let's see if we have any questions. I mean, I have some, but let's acknowledge that there's an audience here as well. John, Cash?
Yeah, look, they were two fantastic talks. Thank both of you very much for that. I'm in pretty much agreement with everything that both of you were saying, even if there's perhaps tensions between them to some extent that I don't yet understand, but I'm looking forward to reading both books and sorting that out. There are a few things I'd like to mention, and I'll be very quick. The notion of the minor key or the minor realities is interesting to think about, I think, because if one thinks of a discursive field, a cultural field constituted by competing norms of recognition, and we can pick up Butler here. You know, one of the things that Butler makes very apparent is that the only way that you will really consolidate change is through competing norms of recognition that disrupt the predominance of the already deeply embedded ones. It seems to me that these processes are ongoing all the time, but they typically collapse. And that's, I guess, what both of you are pretty much in agreement with, but of course, we don't want them to always collapse, although perhaps with some of them we do. So this draws me to another aspect, and I'll finish up very quickly. I was a bit intrigued by both Carolyn's story about insomnia and then Eva's reference to Giddens. And of course, what this brings on board is the whole issue of ontological security and ontological insecurity in particular. And I'm just wondering, because of course, ontological security relies so much on habit and process, and one can work through those in more than one way, obviously. One can be very rigid or much more flexible. But I'm just wondering how ontological insecurity and the disruptions of that can be figured into the prospects for transformation.
Who wants to take that first?
Maybe Eva can, since I spoke.
Yeah, I have one immediate thought. So I think this question of ontological security and insecurity is really important, and it partly also answers, or I thought Carolyn answered without making it explicit, my question about how do we console people over the loss of certain practices. And like, if we are seriously on the level of habit, then we will already have something else embodied and concrete to replace that with. And if you don't have that, then also you will not see the change. But I think when I would want to add to that, that ontological security then eventually needs to be more than being free-flowing or being unhampered in one's practices. It also needs to be something like what Karl Polanyi would call social protection. Like, I do think in the end, it's also a question of material solidarity that like it gives, and I think part of the problem we have at the moment is trying to have a revolution in a time of, or like any kind of meaningful reform would already be so beautiful, in a time of very heightened insecurity because of like neoliberal austerity and climate catastrophe and all those things like that. That makes the stakes so much higher, and I think that makes us a regression to very crude and basic habits and routines so pressing as something to work against. Yeah, I think there was a first half of the question that I now forgot because I was so excited about the second, but I leave it at that. Thank you, Joan.
I might just add that I think ontological insecurity is actually a very powerful description of what insomnia amounts to, what it feels like. And I mean, just to stay with that example, like as harrowing as that was personally for me over almost a decade of kind of this ongoing inability to sleep, is that insecurity or that shaking up or that desire for something to change so that I could sleep again, but also what other things might need to change in order for that to happen, opened me up to new forms of practice. It opened me up to, I mean, even though I talk about all these, therapies and processes I went through that didn't work, of course, they all did work in different ways to different degrees over time. You become opened up maybe to a more mindful way of inhabiting experience as it unfolds, which for me is useful kind of to a type of mindfulness or a shift of attention, which was helpful for sleeping. But without trying to simply suggest that we scale up from individual habits to think about the collective, I do try to kind of make a link between that openness or that shaking up to new forms of practice emerging and to kind of the modes that we can inhabit experience as it unfolds, that we can sense kind of what's going on beneath the surface and possibilities that haven't been activated, but could be, as being important to social transformation on a wider scale. So I think there's an element to thinking about ontological insecurity that can be generative, although we could think about many ways, of course, which it's harmful and not so.
I might quickly ventriloquize Anna Moody's point in the chat about Caroline. She asked about Dewey, and Anna says she spent years reading his work and recasting it, but pragmatists never seem to read cultural studies or feminists' take on pragmatism. And I guess I also wanted to add to that, I guess to bring Eva into that as well, I know that in the Frankfurt School critical theory, like Dewey has become a more prominent figure, sort of post Habermas and Honneth, and also Rahel Yegi. So I also wondered about this idea of bringing Dewey into critical theory in the Frankfurt sense as well. If Carolyn, you go first, and then Eva.
Yeah, I mean, I first remember encountering Dewey as an undergrad in Canada, reading some of the stuff on education, and I literally never thought that I would return to that again. So it was a surprise to me as much as anyone else that would be a key figure in this work. I guess I was following some of the work on habit and habituation, which led me to the American pragmatists, and so I had a go at reading Dewey's book on habit. Habit runs throughout his work, but there's one primary book on human nature that it's key in. And I guess what attracted me to that was this kind of focus on process and processuality, experience as it unfolds, but also the speculative nature of that. What does inhabiting the present, rather than kind of only looking towards a projected future, open up for thinking about possibilities of change in the here and now that have future implications, but that can be perhaps more imaginative, maybe more radical than what we have. That was really interesting and surprising to me about Dewey's work. Of course, that intersects with contemporary affect theories, new materialisms, various ecological theories. But Anne is absolutely right that, there's not that intersection with kind of Dewey in terms of other stuff that was going on more contemporary kind of with his time. And I guess for me, that's why I felt that these classical theories of habit, whether pragmatist or kind of more continental philosophies, had to be brought into conversation with more contemporary feminist, anti-racist, queer, decolonial literatures. I mean, I think there's a question, Anna, about like, what are the risks of taking these kind of figures who were writing in the 1830s or the 1920s and trying to mobilize them for the work of contemporary critical theory. If you look at Ravissant's work on habit, he's actually thinking a lot about theology, and he's thinking about how do you preserve the power of the church to kind of discipline collective habits through their ways in a context where all of these kind of new scientific and philosophical models are opening up to think about that differently. So I think there's ongoing risks and dangers really there that I'm trying to kind of negotiate in the work, and I'm not sure exactly where that ends up.
Yeah, I think I'm happy to, I think that was a great answer. And I did write one sort of younger Frankfurt School scholar who I think kind of qualifies in the chat. But my overall impression would also be that in the traditions I work, then if you have pragmatism, it's still like completely devoid of any of the feminist or other continental philosophy approaches to learning and processes. And I actually think that for feminist exchange, then some parts of the Wittgensteinian tradition, which is also has been quite important for practice theory, especially through Cora Diamond or then the work of Alice Crary, have been more fruitful to kind of be in exchange with. Then, I mean, so not even very clear what the pragmatist tradition would be today. I mean, maybe I have this thing when I switch languages that I block on names. The big book about progress. Well, anyway, yeah, whatever. Let's not name them if they don't name us. So I think they're, yeah, then one can also maybe abandon that if it's a one-way road of reception.
I did appreciate that Carolyn also distinguished philosophical pragmatism from political pragmatism as well, which is an easy mistake to make as well. Okay, so the whole idea of having this early an hour was to like not make anyone exhausted. I'm sure we could keep going, but it just leaves more appetite for reading the books and continuing the dialogue, I hope. So thank you both for being here.
Sure.
Thanks to the
Thank
audience.
you so much.
Yeah,
For the
thank you very much
questions
for
and all the engagement. That's amazing.
absolutely. Yeah.
I still love Zoom. I mean, I wouldn't have met all of you. It's just wonderful. Thank you. Though it's of course also an extractivist infrastructure that connects us here. Thank you, Ben, for putting that together.
Flying to Berlin is also an extractivist infrastructure.
Oh, well, yeah, I know. That's not there's always worse. Yeah, and Caroline, I hope we have some more joint book launches. It's so much fun.
Absolutely, yeah. And I'm glad we had a time zone that worked for Australia-based colleagues and other colleagues that the North American time zones don't usually work for. That's been really great.
Someone's always excluded. It's the Americans today, but they can watch back and